Hey there. Tonight we begin in a place where mist curls low over cobblestone streets, and the scent of jasmine tea drifts like a forgotten melody through the warm evening air. You're about to be transported to the heart of the Tang Dynasty, where poems were currency, and falling in love often began with a glance across a bustling market. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Li Shen wasn't looking for love that morning. He had set out from the village inn just after dawn, his satchel light with only a few scrolls and a worn ink brush. The hem of his robe brushed against dew-kissed grass as he wandered toward the riverside market, drawn by rumor more than purpose. Something about a tea merchant's daughter whose blends could calm the mind and stir the soul. The air smelled of morning rain and lotus leaves. The sun, half asleep behind peach-colored clouds, spilled a golden blush over the roofs of wooden stalls. It wasn't the grandeur of Chang'an, where court poets sipped wine and recited verse beneath palace eaves. This was a quiet village, small and humming with its own rhythm. But it was exactly the kind of place where inspiration waited in a corner, tucked between a bowl of plum candies and a stack of bamboo fans. Li Shen paused near a pond flanked by willows, their branches dragging across the water like brushstrokes. A heron stood still on one leg. Somewhere behind him, the sounds of the market began to stir, baskets being dropped onto tables, calloused hands slicing open sacks of grain, a child's laughter cutting the air like wind chimes. Then he heard a voice, bright, laughing, wrapped in silk, yet strong, like the crackle of a fire. He turned, and there she was. She was pouring hot water over a clay teapot, steam rising in soft clouds around her. Her sleeves, pale green and embroidered with tiny jasmine blossoms, fluttered as she moved. Her hair was pinned simply with a single comb of ivory and gold. The stall was modest, bundles of loose-leaf tea arranged in ceramic jars, little hand-painted tags tied with string, but it felt like a stage. And she, unknowingly, its star. He didn't know her name yet, but he already knew she was a poem waiting to be written. He stepped closer, slowly, not because he was shy, but because he was afraid the moment might shatter if he moved too fast. The way light fell on her face, the curl of a steam rising between them, it was too perfect to be real. She looked up, and their eyes met. Not long, just enough for her to notice the ink smudged along his thumb, enough for him to catch the faint scent of roasted oolong clinging to her wrist, enough to feel something shift inside him, like a line of verse he'd never been able to finish until now. He said nothing, neither did she. The moment passed. A customer arrived, asking for a blend to help his wife sleep better. She turned, smiling, and began her practiced explanation of flour ratios and steeping times. Li Shen watched as her hands moved with grace, her voice dipping and rising like a well-loved melody. And then, without thinking, he pulled out a scrap of parchment. Just a line, a beginning. There is a girl who pours steam like dreams from her sleeves, and I have lost the will to look away. He smiled to himself, folded the paper, and slipped it into his satchel. Tomorrow, he thought, he'd come back with a better poem. The next morning, Li Shen arrived before the first kettle had boiled. He stood under the same willow tree, its branches still dripping with dawn's dew, the hem of his robe a little damp from crossing the grass too early. He hadn't slept well. The half-finished poem still tugged at him, restless and unformed, like a kite in windless skies. The image of her, pouring tea with a smile that curved like a crescent moon, had stitched itself into his dreams. He told himself it was curiosity, that he was simply intrigued by her craftsmanship, by the art of tea blending he knew so little about. But the truth nestled deeper, quieter. He wanted to see if the softness in her eyes had been real, or merely something the steam had drawn from his imagination. The market was still stretching awake. A sleepy rooster crowed behind a wooden fence. Merchants swept the dust from their stalls with wide brooms. Li Shen made his way toward her corner slowly, not wanting to seem too eager, but unable to disguise the quiet joy building in his chest. She was already there, not behind the counter yet, but kneeling beside a shallow ceramic basin, rinsing teacups under a trickle of water from a clay jar. Her sleeves were rolled up just enough to show the curve of her wrists. Her hair was tied differently today, pinned with a small jade clasp shaped like a leaf. He stood for a moment, just watching. Then she looked up and saw him. This time she smiled. "Good morning, poet." The words caught him off guard. Not just the fact that she spoke, but that she already knew what he was. He blinked, then smiled back. "Is it that obvious?" She laughed softly and gestured toward the ink stain still faint on his hand. "It's always the fingers that give you away." He stepped closer, resting one hand gently on the edge of her wooden counter. "I didn't know I was so transparent. I see a lot of people here," she said, setting a teacup down and rising to her feet. "Farmers, merchants, travelers, but not many who look at tea like it's already a verse." Li Shen chuckled. "Then maybe it's the tea that writes the poem. I'm just the one holding the brush." She tilted her head, considering. "That's a lovely way to put it." He reached into his satchel and, without hesitation, unfolded the parchment from yesterday. The ink had dried slightly uneven from the humidity, but the lines were clear. "I wrote this after seeing you pour that first cup," he said. "It's not finished, but, well, poems rarely are." She took the paper gently, her fingers brushing his as she did. She read silently, lips barely moving. When she looked up, her eyes were softer than the morning mist. "No one's ever written about my tea before," she said. "Then it's long overdue." For a while, they stood like that, between shelves of fragrant leaves and the low murmur of the waking market. The moment didn't rush. It didn't need to. "I'm May," she said finally. "Li Shen." "I know," she smiled. "Your poems travel faster than you do." He laughed a little sheepishly. "I'm flattered. I didn't think anyone outside the capital paid attention to those old verses." "Sometimes," she said, "a small town needs poetry, even more." Their eyes held for another beat. Then she turned, gesturing to the small kettle, now beginning to hiss. "Stay," she said. "Let me pour you something. Something special." He nodded, settling onto the stool beside her stall. And just like that, a new ritual began. One of warm cups passed between quiet hands, of verses born from laughter, of looks that lingered just a moment too long, and perhaps just perhaps the beginning of a love steeping in silence. By the third morning, it was no longer a coincidence. Li Shen arrived just as the sunlight slipped through the eaves of the tea merchant stalls, dousing everything in a golden glow. He didn't pretend anymore that he was only walking through the market on a whim. The poem he claimed to be working on was still the same one, unfinished, unfolding slowly, like a bud reluctant to bloom. But in truth, it was May he came to see. She was already waiting, not behind the stall this time, but standing just a little to the side, sweeping fallen petals into a neat pile. Pale pink camellia blossoms had scattered across the ground like misplaced stars, and she moved among them carefully, almost reverently. When she saw him, her smile reached her eyes. "You're early today," she teased, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. "I could say the same about you," he replied, hands tucked inside the sleeves of his robe. She set the broom aside and nodded toward the small wooden bench beside her stall. "I saved you the good seat." He sat, watching as she returned to her counter and pulled down a bamboo canister from the upper shelf. "Today," she said with a flourish, "you're going to try snow orchid." Li Shen raised an eyebrow. "Snow orchid?" "A blend my mother taught me," May said, lifting the lid. A gentle fragrance unfurled into the air, cool, crisp, with a hint of sweetness beneath. White tea leaves with dried orchid petals and just a touch of pomelo zest. It's for calm mornings and restless hearts. Are you saying I look restless? I'm saying you've been walking around with the same half-written poem for 3 days. He laughed, guilty. As she boiled the water and warmed the teapot, there was a comfortable hush between them. The market had begun to stir behind them, voices rising like birdsong. But here, under the soft shade of her linen awning, it felt like the world was in slow motion. She poured the tea with her usual grace, 3 precise motions, smooth as brushstrokes. When she handed him the cup, their fingers touched. Neither of them pulled away. He took a sip. The flavor was delicate, floral, layered. It lingered in his mouth, like a gentle thought refusing to fade. "May," he said softly, "do you ever wonder if tea can carry memories?" She looked thoughtful. "I think it does. Not just flavors, but moments. Hands that harvested the leaves, wind that brushed the hills, the quiet of a rainy afternoon when you drank it for the first time. And now," he murmured, "this one will taste like your voice saying my name." That made her smile, gently, almost shyly. "And yours," she replied, like the sound of paper unfolding. He glanced down at his satchel, where fresh sheets waited for words. "I've been trying to write about you," he confessed, "but it never quite comes out right." "Maybe it's not ready yet," she said. "Some things need to steep longer." There was silence, but not the kind that needed filling. He let the warmth of the tea settle in his chest, let the sweetness rest on his tongue, let her presence wind itself quietly into the corners of his day. And then, gently, May broke the quiet. "Would you like to walk with me tomorrow? I need to visit the orchard by the East Hill. It's where I gather the orchid petals." Li Shen looked at her, heart nudging forward, as if something invisible had just clicked into place. "I'd be honored." And just like that, the invitation hung between them, not loud, not grand, but full of the promise of something still unfolding, like a poem, like a cup of tea, like love beginning to bloom in silence. The path to the orchard wove gently through the outskirts of the city, past narrow canals where ducks paddled and willow branches kissed the water's surface. The air was softer here, full of the sense of damp earth and ripening fruit, and the occasional clatter of a passing ox cart faded quickly into the hush of late morning. Li Shen walked beside Mei, their steps unhurried, as if time itself had decided to stroll. She carried a basket over her arm, lined with pale cloth and tied with a red silk cord. It swung gently with her stride, brushing against the folds of her dress. Her long braid shimmered in the light, dark as ink on parchment. So, this is where Snow Orchid begins, Li Shen murmured, scanning the lush grove ahead. The orchard unfolded like a secret garden, boughs heavy with white blossoms, vines curling along stone walls, and bees humming from bloom to bloom. This is where most of my blends begin, May said, voice quiet but full of pride. My family has gathered from here for generations. They stepped beneath a canopy of trees, where shadows dappled their faces and the air cooled around their skin. May reached up toward a low-hanging branch, fingers careful, and plucked a pair of small orchid flowers with their petals still gently curled. These are best before noon, she explained, handing one to him. Sunrise holds their sweetness. By afternoon, they lose their tenderness. Li Shen cupped the flower in his palm, staring at it as if it might whisper a verse to him. It's delicate, he said softly, like a thought just before it becomes a poem. She glanced at him, her smile lingering at the corners. And you're still thinking of your poem? I'm starting to think of it less as a poem and more as a feeling, he replied. Something you can't quite name, but you know it's there. They moved deeper into the orchard, gathering in companionable silence. May knelt occasionally to brush away fallen petals or check for early sprouts, her movements precise and reverent. Li Shen watched her with a kind of quiet awe, realizing more and more that she belonged to this place, the way words belonged to breath. You see how the branches twist, she said, pointing to one that looped like a dancer's arm. My mother used to say, it's because they listen to the wind and follow its rhythm. He laughed. Trees with rhythm. That sounds like a metaphor I'd write. Well, she grinned, maybe you're more like the orchard than you think. They paused under a larger tree where the blossoms clustered thickly. May sat on a smooth stone, patting the space beside her. Li Shen joined, shoulders brushing, neither of them moving away. Do you ever miss it? She asked suddenly. The capital, the court, all those grand halls filled with poetry and performance. He shook his head. I thought I would, but now his gaze drifted upward, past the branches, and into the soft blue sky. Now I think I've found better verses here, in tea leaves, in footsteps on dewy grass, in someone who knows when to steep and when to stay silent. She didn't speak, but her gaze settled on him, warm and unwavering. The breeze rustled through the leaves, carrying the scent of the orchard and something softer, something unsaid, and then, without fanfare or flourish, he reached out and gently tucked a blossom into the side of her braid. It wasn't a declaration, not yet, but it was something, a verse, a beginning, a line written quietly across the page of the morning. They stayed a little longer under that tree, the basket slowly filling between them, their shadows touching, their silences saying more than words ever could. And when they walked back, the world seemed quieter, as if even the wind was holding its breath for whatever would come next. That afternoon, back at the shop, the world felt a little warmer. May's father, Master Leon, was crouched over a shallow wooden tray, hands sifting through drying jasmine petals as if they were gold dust. The backroom air shimmered with fragrance, floral, earthy, and familiar. May and Li Shen entered quietly, their orchard basket brimming with blossoms and soft green leaves. The light filtered in golden beams through the paper windows, catching on the steam curling from a waiting kettle. Master, Leon didn't look up at first. You've brought back more than I expected, he said. Did the trees whisper to you today? Daughter, they told me to bring a poet, May replied, setting down the basket. One who listens better than most. Master Leon's eyes finally flicked toward Li Shen. For a heartbeat, there was the weight of scrutiny, not unkind, but layered with the quiet protectiveness of a father who'd seen too much. You write poems, he said. Li Shen bowed slightly. I try. Then you know how to wait for the right moment. Good tea is the same. He gestured for them to join him. There was already a pot on the table, steam gently rising. 3 cups, one for each of them. May slipped onto a low stool beside Li Shen, her fingers unconsciously tapping the edge of the teacup in rhythm with her thoughts. This, Master Leon began, is the base of our snow orchid blend. Not the flowers, not the name, just the leaves, rolled by hand, fired over low charcoal. It takes a steady hand and a patient mind. Li Shen nodded. Like revision. Exactly, Master Leon said, almost smiling. Now taste. He poured, steady as ink, spilling from a brush. The liquid was pale, with a whisper of jade green. Li Shen lifted his cup and sipped. It was light, but not faint, fragrant without being floral. The finish lingered, soft and slightly mineral, like mountain air at dawn. It's like quiet confidence, Li Shen murmured. Master Leon raised a brow. Or a girl who seems shy, but has the mind of a strategist. May nudged her father with a laugh. You're just fishing for compliments now. I'm testing his tongue, he said, eyes twinkling, and his heart. The second steeping was stronger. The flavor deepened. May leaned closer to Li Shen, explaining how temperature changed the story in each sip. He listened, but more than that, he absorbed. Every detail seemed to find a home in his thoughts, waiting to bloom into lines unwritten. You don't talk much about your family, May said quietly as they cleaned up, or why you left Chang'an. Li Shen's hands paused, wrapped around a warm clay bowl. They wanted me to rise in the courts, marry well, recite for governors and princes, but I wanted something else. Words that weren't bought. Love, that didn't come with contracts. She looked at him carefully, her face open, not judging. I came here for silence, he continued, voice low. But I stayed for something that makes the silence feel less lonely. Outside, the first hint of dusk pressed against the window. The tea room took on a softer glow, gold turning to amber. The shadows stretched longer. May reached into her apron and drew out a folded square of parchment. I want you to read this. Li Shen opened it carefully. A short poem, elegant, uncertain, beautiful. Not his. You wrote this? She nodded. It's not much. Just something I scribbled one night after the market. He read it again, slowly, then once more. It's full of longing, he said finally, and restraint. She watched him, a blush creeping into her cheeks. I've only ever shared it with the stars. And now, you. He looked up at her, the corners of his eyes softening. Then I must treat it as a sacred thing. There was silence again. Not awkward, but delicate. Master Leon was in the other room now, pretending not to listen. The kettle whistled faintly. I think, Li Shen said, voice just above a whisper. Your poem is a better start to mine than anything I could write alone. May's breath caught, but she didn't speak. They stood in the waning light, tea on their lips, poetry between them. And just beyond the door, the night waited, patient and full of promise. Night had softened the edges of everything. Lanterns lined the narrow street, glowing like lazy fireflies caught in still glass. Somewhere down the lane, a zither played, slow, melancholic, its notes rippling through the air like the surface of a quiet lake. Li Shen stood alone in his rented courtyard, the parchment with May's poem still cradled in his hands. He read it again by moonlight, each line whispering a kind of bravery he hadn't known existed in her. She had bared a piece of her soul in ink, and now it stirred something tender and disarmed in him. The moon hung low and round, casting silver across his writing table. He dipped his brush, the ink smooth and ready. But tonight, the words didn't come from intellect or practice. They came from her, from the way her fingers curled around a teacup, from how she looked down before meeting his gaze, from her voice, warm as steeped jasmine. He began to write, not verses of grandeur or politics, but something delicate and filled with wonder. Beneath the weight of silence, she presses leaves to heart and flame, and offers me a cup where longing tastes like spring rain. The brush paused. He didn't need more. That was enough for tonight. The next morning, the scent of roasted oolong drifted toward him long before he reached the shop. He found May outside, sleeves rolled, sweeping petals from the stone threshold. You're early, she said without looking up. I couldn't sleep. Words kept me up. She smirked. And here I thought poets thrived on insomnia. I brought you something. He reached into his sleeve and produced a folded square of parchment, his response to her poem. She took it carefully, eyes scanning the lines, her lips parted slightly at the second verse. At the end, she pressed the paper against her chest. You wrote this because of me? Not just because, he said, but for. She smiled, small and real, and suddenly the street didn't feel like a street. It felt like the beginning of a page. Inside, Master Leon was preparing for market day. The back room bustled with movement, jars sealed, bags tied with twine, wooden trays carefully stacked. But May lingered with Li Shen by the door. We sell at the southern square this week, she said, brushing her hair back. Would you want to come? As a helper? As a friend? Or a Maybe something else. He grinned. Poet in residence. She rolled her eyes. Poet on sack carrying duty. So they went together, baskets of tea slung between them, the sun just rising above the tiled rooftops. The southern square buzzed with life, vendors shouting prices, strings of garlic swinging from beams, children darting between stalls with sticky fingers. But there was one stall, quieter than the rest, Leon's tea and tinctures, modest but elegant, with 3 new calligraphy placards pinned beside the tins. Li Shen blinked. Did you? May looked smug. Your verse makes good advertising. He leaned in to read. Rain rests in every leaf. Heat meets heart. Drink slowly. And remember, customers paused to read. An old woman smiled. A young scholar jotted something in his notebook. By noon, the jasmine oolong was nearly gone. As they packed up, May turned to him. Her cheeks flushed, not from heat, but something warmer. You belong in poetry, she said, but you also belong here. Li Shen looked at her. The way the sunlight touched her hair, the curve of her shoulders as she bent to tie a bundle of twine. I think, he said softly, I was always writing toward this. A breeze swept through the market, tugging at his sleeve, lifting a single line of parchment from the calligraphy stand. It danced up, fluttering skyward like a bird let loose from its cage. They both looked up, shielding their eyes, and laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt exactly right. And beneath that wide Tang Dynasty sky, full of smoke trails and promise, a poet and a tea merchant's daughter walked home, their steps almost perfectly in rhythm. The late summer heat settled over the city like a warm blanket, and in the shaded back garden of the tea shop, everything slowed to a dreamlike tempo. Bamboo rustled softly. A pair of butterflies spiraled above the pond where fat orange koi swam lazily beneath lily pads. May sat beneath the wisteria, threading a string through paper tags for the week's tea jars. Her hair was twisted into a loose knot, a few strands curling down her neck. Li Shen reclined nearby on a low wooden bench, lazily fanning himself with a folded scroll. He'd spent the morning in the hills, gathering inspiration, or so he claimed, but May suspected it was more about escaping the midday bustle of Chang'an. Still, she didn't mind. His presence had become a rhythm she looked forward to, like the sound of the bells in the afternoon breeze. Do you always look this serene when you're not writing? She teased without looking up. He chuckled. Only when I'm near someone who knows how to quiet my thoughts. She glanced at him, caught off guard. Her fingers paused mid-thread, the string slipping a little from her grasp. You mean tea, she said quickly, cheeks warming. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. I meant you. A hush settled between them, not awkward, but curious. May looked down at the tag she was tying and looped the knot a little slower this time. I thought poets only spoke like that in their verses. Sometimes it leaks out, he said, a grin tugging at his lips. She shook her head, but she smiled. Your charm is exhausting. You haven't even seen my best line yet. She raised an eyebrow. He took a breath, then recited from memory, eyes locked with hers. If I were ink and you the paper, I would never stop writing just to stay close to your skin. May blinked. She tried to laugh it off, but couldn't quite manage it. That's she said softly. Unfair? No, he replied, voice gentler now, just honest. Before she could answer, a shout came from the shop's front. Door! May! There's a courier here. From Luoyang. She stood quickly, heart racing for a reason she couldn't quite name. I'll be right back. Li Shen watched her disappear through the garden gate. In her absence, the silence stretched longer. He looked up at the canopy of wisteria, then down at the small trail she'd left behind. A fallen tag, the spool of string, a faint floral scent in the air. It was astonishing how the world could feel fuller just because one person walked through it. Inside, May unfolded the letter with careful hands. It was from her cousin, married into a merchant family in Luoyang. The message was casual on the surface. Updates about trade routes, mention of an upcoming mid-autumn festival. But one line caught her eye. They say the imperial court is calling for poets again. They're preparing a new anthology for the emperor's banquet. May's stomach flipped. She glanced toward the back garden, where Li Shen sat. Would he go back to court? Could he? Would he leave? That evening, they shared dinner on the rooftop. Peach wine, sesame buns, and slices of duck. May had crisped herself. The city glittered below. 1,000 lanterns, blinking like starlight, drawn down to earth. Luoyang sent word, she said after a while, her voice light. They want poets. Li Shen's hand stilled around his cup. The court? She nodded. He didn't speak for a long moment. I thought I'd grown past that world, but you haven't, she said quietly. You still dream in verses. You still look at clouds like they're trying to tell you something. He met her eyes. And if I go, I don't know, she replied honestly. I suppose I'd go on blending leaves and pretending the steam doesn't remind me of your breath on glass. His fingers closed over hers then, firm, warm. Would you wait for me? He asked. Her heart beat so loud, she wondered if he could hear it. I don't wait, she whispered. I make tea. And if the door opens and you walk through it again, then maybe you'll find I saved your favorite blend. He smiled, eyes a little wet in the corners. That sounds a lot like waiting. Maybe, she murmured. Maybe it does. And under the velvet Tang sky, with moonlight catching the edge of his sleeve, and her hair glinting silver in the wind, they both knew something was shifting. Not breaking, just moving, like the slow pour of hot water, coaxing the leaves open, one layer at a time. The morning Li Shen left was wrapped in mist. Chang'an's city walls loomed faint in the early haze, and the streets had not yet filled with vendors, or gossip, or song. May stood beside the shop's bamboo gate, holding a small parcel wrapped in indigo cloth, his favorite oolong blend, a note tucked inside, and 2 candied plums sealed in wax paper. Li Shen bowed low to her before mounting his horse. He had no entourage, just a satchel of scrolls, and the echo of her touch on his sleeve. She kept her smile steady, even as her fingers trembled against the gate. I'll be back before the autumn leaves fall, he said. May nodded. That's not very long. It will feel longer, he replied, and then he was gone. She didn't cry. Not immediately. She swept the garden. She folded cloths. She arranged the new shipment of jasmine pearls. But when she brewed tea that evening, alone on the rooftop, she caught herself pouring 2 cups. In Luoyang, Li Shen was swallowed by a different rhythm. The city was colder than he remembered, bigger, richer, louder. Ministers and poets roamed the halls of jade-paneled estates. Banquets lit up the nights with red lanterns and silk-draped courtesans. There were readings, competitions, and endless whispers of favors to be won. Li Shen wrote. Of course, he always wrote, but his poems had begun to change. They were quieter now, softer, less about emperors and more about the scent of roasted tea leaves, about the way sunlight moved through green curtains, about a girl with ink-stained fingers and a laugh like wind chimes. The head of the Imperial Anthology Committee took notice. You've matured, he said over one of Li Shen's pieces. There's restraint here, and depth. Li Shen bowed, accepting the praise with practiced grace. But his heart was not in the marble halls. It lingered on the rooftop of a tea shop in Chang'an, where shadows danced and hands touched only briefly. One night, after a particularly grand banquet, he slipped away early, down to the river. A lone lantern bobbed on the water. He took out a scrap of parchment and began to write, not for court, not for prestige, just for her. Every poem I write is a cup of tea poured in your name, and every pause between lines, a sigh waiting to return home. Meanwhile, back in Chang'an, May had started writing too. Not poems, letters. She kept them in a small chest under her bed, never sent. Lines about the garden's first plum blossom, about a customer who looked like he was carrying 3 secrets in his beard, about a dream where Li Shen came back, wearing a robe stitched with cranes, and said nothing, just reached for her hand. She missed his voice, not the things he said, but the way he said them, like words were precious, only when whispered. By midsummer, news came by merchant caravan. The Emperor's anthology had been completed. Li Shen's name was on the cover. The scrolls would be distributed to every major hall in the empire. And then came a letter, not one of May's, his. I'll be on the road at first light. Save me a seat in the garden. She read it 3 times before believing it. She tucked it into her apron, then into the small blue teapot they used for special guests, then finally pressed against her chest when no one was looking. The day of his return arrived like thunder hidden in silk. She wore a red ribbon in her hair. The one he'd once said reminded him of maple leaves against snow. She lit incense in the garden. She opened the windows wide. When he appeared in the doorway, dusty and tired, but smiling like someone who'd remembered how to breathe, she didn't say anything. She just poured the tea. He took the first sip in, silence. Then, softly, "You've improved the blend." "You were gone," she replied. "I had time to think." Their laughter folded into the rustle of bamboo, and the distance between them unraveled, like steam rising from porcelain. Outside, the summer rain began to fall, soft and slow, like a curtain drawing closed on the first act of something deeper. They became something of a rumor in the neighborhood. The poet who returned from Luoyang with scrolls stamped in red lacquer, and the tea merchant's daughter who brewed tea as if she were steeping her own heart. People started arriving, not just for tea, but to listen to them talk. Li Shen leaning against the wooden railing of the shop's veranda, reading aloud verses written on old rice paper, while May corrected him gently on the names of tea cultivars or the scent of a specific spring blossom. Their rhythm was subtle. He would look at her before he recited. She would glance at him before she poured. No declarations, no dramatic gestures, just the quiet certainty of two lives inching toward the same future. In the early mornings, they'd climb the hill behind the shop with fresh buns tucked into paper. May would bring a pot of her best oolong and a basket of books, philosophy, farming manuals, old love ballads that made her blush halfway through. Li Shen would bring a brush and a blank scroll. "This is my studio now," he'd say, setting up beneath the lone pine tree. "And I suppose I'm the ink master," May would tease, offering him a clean cloth or a refill of water for his brush. They spoke little while he worked. Birds sang in the distance. Vendors called from the alleys below. The breeze sometimes caught his parchment, and May would press it down with her palm, careful not to smudge the strokes. One day, she asked, "What do you write when you're not writing for the emperor?" He looked up. "Truthfully?" She nodded. "I write about tea, about light on wood, about how your voice lingers after you walk away." She blushed, but didn't hide her face this time. "I think you write better when you miss me." "I do," he said, "but I'd rather stay close and write less perfectly." Late that summer, a visitor came, a distant cousin of May's from Suzhou, a merchant with polished manners and eyes that swept the shop like an auditor. He stayed for 3 days. May was polite, but quiet. Li Shen kept out of the way, helping in the garden, though he listened closely every time the man laughed too loudly or spoke too long. When the visitor left, he took nothing but tea, and a question he had asked May privately, overheard through the thin screen doors. "You're not thinking of marrying a poet, are you? You deserve a real future. This shop could grow. You could come to Suzhou. We have better prospects there." Li Shen said nothing about it for a while, until one night, when the cicadas sang so loudly they couldn't hear their own thoughts, he finally asked her, "Would you leave? For Suzhou or anywhere else?" May looked up from the pot she was scrubbing. "I'd leave for the right reason," she said, "but I wouldn't leave the right person." He nodded, then reached for her hand, soap suds and all, and brought it gently to his lips. That night, he wrote a new poem. He didn't show it to her, just placed it beneath her tea tray the next morning. "Let the cities shine with gold. Let emperors praise my rhyme. But I'll trade it all for one morning of your smile steeped in jasmine time." She didn't respond in words, but the tea she made that day had a new floral note he'd never tasted before. Soft, sweet, and lingering, like something blooming in the silence between them. One afternoon, the air was thick with the promise of rain, and a low mist rolled in from the hills behind the tea shop. May was experimenting with a new blend of osmanthus and pu'er, trying to coax out a delicate balance when Li Shen entered, carrying something unusual, a lacquered box bound in silk ribbon. He didn't speak right away, just set it on the table between them. "What's this?" May asked, brushing stray leaves from her hands. "I thought," he hesitated, "if you're going to inspire all my best poems, you might as well be the one who keeps them." She unwrapped the ribbon carefully, revealing a collection of his scrolls. Each one bore his careful, elegant, brushstrokes, poems that had earned him admiration in the court. Yes, but also quieter ones, unpublished, personal. She leafed through them in silence. Some she remembered him reciting by the riverside, others she'd never seen before. And there, tucked between poems about mountain winds and autumn skies, was one written for her. You smiled in springtime's earliest hour. The wind paused just to watch. Even the plum blossoms waited, afraid to bloom before you. May blinked. You wrote this that day in the market, didn't you? He gave her a small, crooked smile. You saw me. I saw you stop walking mid-step, and then scribble like a madman on your sleeve. He laughed, his ears turning pink. It was becoming a pattern. These small revelations, tucked between tea leaves and poetry ink. He told her things now. How he once dreamed of being a monk, but loved flavors and laughter too much. How his mother used to hum folk songs when she cooked. How he'd never believed in fate until her, and she shared too, of the time she got lost in the tea fields as a child, following a butterfly. How she secretly added osmanthus to her father's prized white tea just to see if sweetness could be grown, not just brewed. And how she'd once sworn she'd never fall for a man who talked more to paper than people. But here we are, she murmured one evening, as rain drizzled onto the stone courtyard. They had moved closer, not just in words, but in the quiet ways lovers do. His coat now hung behind the tea counter. Her combs rested beside his inkstones. The villagers no longer asked if they were together. They simply referred to the shop as the poet's house or May's tea and love. But not everyone was pleased. A letter came from the capital, a summoning. The court, having read his recent verses, richer, softer, full of nuance, demanded his return. They wanted him to tutor a prince. It was a rare honor, a duty, one that could secure his legacy. When he read it aloud, May said nothing at first, just kept arranging dried petals into little glass jars. He waited. Finally, she asked, "Would you be happy there?" "I'd be honored." "That's not the same thing." "No, it's not." Silence stretched between them, long and brittle. Then she looked up. Her eyes didn't waver. "I'll never ask you to stay. But if you go, I'll wait. Just don't ask me to stop brewing tea like you might walk through the door tomorrow." He reached for her hand, fingers trembling just slightly. "And if I asked you to come with me? To the palace? To anywhere?" May smiled sadly. "Li Shen, I steep leaves and listen to wind. I don't wear silk slippers or bow to ministers. That's not the world where I breathe." He nodded, not because he agreed, but because he understood. That night, neither of them slept much. He lay awake, staring at the beams of the ceiling. She lit a lantern and read one of his scrolls 3 times over. The next morning, when the clouds cleared, a decision had to be made, and neither of them wanted to be the first to speak it. The morning sun painted long golden strokes across the tea shop floor, yet the warmth did little to ease the chill between them. May prepared his favorite jasmine tea, just as she had every morning since the day he'd first arrived. She placed the porcelain cup before him without a word, her hands steady, though her heart beat unevenly in her chest. Li Shen took a sip. The taste, fragrant and soft, unfolded like memory on his tongue. He set the cup down slowly, almost reverently. I leave at noon, he said, not looking at her. The messenger waits beyond the village. May nodded, staring at the steam curling up from the kettle. Have you packed? Yes, only a few things. The rest, I'll send for later, if needed. She stirred the tea leaves, drying on a bamboo tray. You'll teach well, she said after a pause. I hope they appreciate the kind of words you give the world. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. There was nothing elegant to say, only things that would ache too much. Instead, he reached into his satchel and pulled out a folded paper. Wrote you something. She took it with both hands, unfolding the parchment slowly. It was a single stanza, barely a breath. If I could fold time, like you fold silk into drawers, neatly, quietly, without pain, I would leave no crease between us. Tears welled in her eyes, catching at the corners like dew on morning petals. Li Shen, I'll write, every week, and if you ever change your mind, she nodded, I'll write too. They stood there, just looking, as if trying to memorize every detail for the long silence ahead. His ink-stained fingers, her tea-sweetened scent, the sunlight that would soon fall on an empty seat. Outside, the mule cart waited. Its wooden wheels creaked gently as the driver hummed an old song from the hills. He turned toward the door, then back to her. Will you walk with me? To the road. She didn't speak, but she did take his hand. The path to the village edge was short, lined with plum trees beginning to bud. It was there, just before the final bend, that he stopped. If I ask one more thing, will you promise not to hate me for it? Her brow furrowed. Curious. What is it? Don't stop blending new teas. Don't let the seasons go stale. I want to imagine the flavors changing, even when I'm not here to taste them. A small smile broke through her sadness. I promise. And you? I'll keep writing poems, where your name hides in the folds. He kissed her forehead, softly, almost like punctuation. Not a goodbye. Not quite. Then he climbed into the cart, gave the driver a nod, and disappeared around the bend, the road curling like a poem with no final line. May stood there long after. The wheels faded. Then, slowly, she turned back toward the shop. Inside, the kettle was still warm, the leaves half dried. The scent of jasmine lingered in the air. She opened her notebook, the one she used only for special blends, and wrote in the margin beside a recipe. First day without him. Added honey instead of sugar. Tastes like memory. The seasons would change. Summer would melt into autumn. Letters would come, and sometimes not. But in that little shop of steam and silence, May waited, not like someone holding their breath, but like someone who'd already been breathed into. The first letter arrived 17 days after Li Shen's departure. It came tucked inside a scroll of poetry from the capital, sealed with crimson wax and his familiar slanted handwriting. May didn't open it immediately. Instead, she carried it with her all day, tucked in her apron pocket as she ground fresh oolong, boiled rainwater from the clay urn, and answered customers with a distant smile. When twilight finally painted the shop in hues of apricot and lavender, she lit a lantern, sat beneath the plum tree behind the shop, and broke the seal. Dearest May, the capital smells of ink and horse sweat. But I think of your tea, how it clung to my lips like spring. I have found lodging near the academy. They are kind, but too proud. They do not read poetry for feeling, only for form. Still, I speak of you often. A tea merchant's daughter, I say, who brews flavor like verse. They laugh. I let them. They don't understand. Tell me the colors of the hills today. Tell me if your jasmine has bloomed. Tell me if you still stir the pot counterclockwise, like you always did when nervous. Elme reread it 3 times before folding it with care. It went into a wooden box beneath her bed, joining the slip of verse he'd given her on the day he left. The weeks grew into months, and the letters kept coming. One arrived with a pressed flower, another with a poem written in ink so dark it bled into the margins. Sometimes he shared stories of city life, the young nobles who pretended to know poetry, the old masters who spoke only in riddles, the lonely moments beneath palace eaves. She answered everyone. She told him of a new blend using wild ginger and pear skin, of how her father now asked after him, grumbling more gently than before, of the village cat who'd adopted the tea shop and refused to leave. Through letters, they grew even closer, no longer just poet and tea maker, but a rhythm of pen and parchment, of ink and steam. And yet, there were days when the shop felt too quiet, days when May reached for 2 cups instead of one, days when a turn of phrase in a letter would echo a touch she hadn't felt in seasons. One such day, in early autumn, she received no letter, and the week after, nothing again. The usual delivery boy said the roads had flooded, or maybe the courier had been rerouted. He wasn't sure. Probably nothing. He shrugged. Still, worry slipped beneath her ribs, like cold tea on an empty stomach. On the 12th day, she wrote anyway. You once told me my silence was steeped in meaning, but this silence is bitter. Please write soon, or come back, or send me a sign that you still walk beneath the same sky. May. She sent it off with trembling hands, then spent the night restocking leaves and herbs, anything to keep her mind from imagining the worst. But it wasn't just fear that kept her up. It was longing. It was the ache of realizing that words, no matter how beautiful, could never replace presence. That letters couldn't kiss your forehead, or smell like old books and wind, or laugh when you oversteeped the brew. May placed her teacup on the windowsill and stared into the star-thick sky. Come back, she whispered. A breeze rustled the plum branches. Somewhere beyond the hills, perhaps in a city far too proud for poetry, someone stirred in the dark and thought of her too. Morning mist curled over the rooftops like spilled milk the day Li Shen returned to the village. He wore a traveling cloak dusted with the soot of many roads, his hair longer, his face thinner, but his eyes, their quiet fire, their storm-soaked softness, had not changed. He walked the cobblestone streets slowly, like someone afraid of waking a memory. At the tea shop, May was arranging glass jars of dried osmanthus blossoms when she heard the bell chime. She didn't turn around immediately. Maybe she thought it was a trick of the wind. But then, that voice, low and a little hoarse, like wind through cedar, spoke. Do you still stir it counterclockwise when nervous? Her hands froze. The jar slipped from her fingers and shattered. She spun around, and there he was, Li Shen, real and dust-covered and smiling like a man who had walked across time just to say her name. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then she laughed, one of those surprised, breathless laughs that escape like birds startled from a tree. "You didn't write," she said, trying not to cry. "The roads flooded," he said, stepping closer. "Then the palace summoned me. Then I tried to write, but every word tasted wrong. The truth is, May, I missed you too much to write, so I walked home instead." She reached out and touched the edge of his sleeve, as if unsure if he was real. He didn't flinch. Instead, he gently lifted her hand and pressed it to his cheek. "I told you once," he said, "poets follow what they love." May blinked back tears. "And tea merchants' daughters wait," she whispered. He laughed then, a sound she hadn't realized she missed, until it bloomed again in her chest. They closed the shop early that day. They sat beneath the plum tree, just as they had before, but this time there were no secrets left between them. May poured him the blend he loved, green leaves with chrysanthemum and ginger, and he recited poems not from memory, but ones he'd written for her, poems about jasmine in the rain, about hands that smelled of tea leaves, about absence that pressed against the skin like winter. He told her how the palace had offered him a position as a royal poet. "How many would kill for that?" she said, eyes wide. "I turned it down," he replied. May blinked. "Why?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a sealed envelope. The wax was pale green. The seal, a plum blossom. "I've bought a cottage," he said, "by the river. It's not far from here. There's space for a garden and for tea." She stared at him, heart thudding like a festival drum. "You came back to stay?" "I came back," he said, "to live, to write for someone who stirs her tea when nervous, to wake to the smell of ginger and hear the soft creak of the kettle. I came back for you, May." Her fingers curled around his. "You're not going to write this as a poem, are you?" she asked, half laughing, half crying. "No," he said, smiling. "Some things are better steeped in silence." And so, beneath the soft whisper of plum blossoms falling, they made no grand declarations, no vows carved in marble or shouted from rooftops, only hands clasped in the afternoon light, only tea cooling between them, forgotten, only a feeling, quiet, steady, undeniable, that this was what home had always meant. Morning mist curled over the rooftops like spilled milk the day Li Shen returned to the village. He wore a traveling cloak, dusted with the soot of many roads, his hair longer, his face thinner, but his eyes, their quiet fire, their storm-soaked softness, had not changed. He walked the cobblestone streets slowly, like someone afraid of waking a memory. At the tea shop, May was arranging glass jars of dried osmanthus blossoms when she heard the bell chime. She didn't turn around immediately. Maybe she thought it was a trick of the wind. But then, that voice, low and a little hoarse, like wind through cedar, spoke. "Do you still stir it counterclockwise when nervous?" Her hands froze. The jar slipped from her fingers and shattered. She spun around, and there he was, Li Shen, real and dust-covered and smiling like a man who had walked across time just to say her name. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then she laughed, one of those surprised, breathless laughs that escape like birds startled from a tree. You didn't write, she said, trying not to cry. The roads flooded, he said, stepping closer. Then the palace summoned me. Then I tried to write, but every word tasted wrong. The truth is, May, I missed you too much to write, so I walked home instead. She reached out and touched the edge of his sleeve, as if unsure if he was real. He didn't flinch. Instead, he gently lifted her hand and pressed it to his cheek. I told you once, he said, poets follow what they love. Mare blinked back tears. And tea merchants' daughters wait, she whispered. He laughed then, a sound she hadn't realized she missed, until it bloomed again in her chest. They closed the shop early that day. They sat beneath the plum tree, just as they had before, but this time there were no secrets left between them. May poured him the blend he loved, green leaves with chrysanthemum and ginger, and he recited poems not from memory, but ones he'd written for her, poems about jasmine in the rain, about hands that smelled of tea leaves, about absence that pressed against the skin like winter. He told her how the palace had offered him a position as a royal poet. How many would kill for that? She said, eyes wide. I turned it down, he replied. May blinked. Why? He reached into his coat and pulled out a sealed envelope. The wax was pale green. The seal, a plum blossom. I've bought a cottage, he said, by the river. It's not far from here. There's space for a garden and for tea. She stared at him, heart thudding like a festival drum. You came back. To stay? I came back, he said, to live. To write for someone who stirs her tea when nervous. To wake to the smell of ginger and hear the soft creak of the kettle. I came back for you, May. Her fingers curled around his. You're not going to write this as a poem, are you? She asked, half laughing, half crying. No, he said, smiling. Some things are better steeped in silence. And so, beneath the soft whisper of plum blossoms falling, they made no grand declarations, no vows, carved in marble or shouted from rooftops. Only hands clasped in the afternoon light, only tea cooling between them, forgotten, only a feeling, quiet, steady, undeniable, that this was what home had always meant. Zishu, Tmaninate, Dongdai Juling, Jishu Yu said, continue, ChatGPT said. Section 14, the river cottage, sat on the edge of spring, like a secret whispered into the world. It was modest, with wooden beams the color of old poetry. Scrolls and shutters painted the pale green of new leaves. Wind chimes made of teacups hung from the porch, and each time the breeze passed, they clinked like laughter. Li Shen and Mei moved in just before the plum trees bloomed again. They spent mornings watching fog lift off the water, their hands warming against delicate porcelain cups. Afternoons were filled with poetry and spices, petals and parchment, as they turned the little house into a sanctuary of flavor and verse. May kept the kitchen stocked with jars, dried ginger, osmanthus, orange, peel, and wild cinnamon bark, and she often disappeared into town to find herbs others had never heard of. Sometimes she'd return with bundles of tea wrapped in silk, humming old market songs as she walked through the door. Li Shen would be waiting at his writing desk, ink on his sleeves and his hair loose around his shoulders, humming the same melody without realizing it. He stopped performing for nobles. He started writing for May little things, a verse tucked into the fold of her scarf, a haiku left on the windowsill beside her morning brew, a line scribbled on the steam-fogged mirror while she bathed. Their love didn't explode like fireworks. It steeped, one slow pour at a time. At night, they sat in the garden, wrapped in shawls, sipping tea and watching fireflies drift like stars had decided to come closer. He'd rest his head against her shoulder, and she'd murmur stories about old tea myths, how the leaves were once whispers from the gods, how love tasted different when brewed with longing. It was simple, yes, but not small. One evening, during the Qingming rains, May returned from the tea fields, soaked and smiling, her hair wild with wind. Li Shen met her at the porch with a dry towel and a kiss pressed to her forehead. "You're muddy," he said, laughing. "Then love me muddy," she replied. He did. There were no servants, no lantern festivals in their name, no riches or proclamations, just the warm hush of soft-spoken mornings and the joy of discovering that sometimes the best things are not written in ink, but lived in silence. Their days fell into a rhythm neither of them had ever dared to imagine. It was not perfect. Some evenings he would write late and forget the kettle. Some mornings she would sigh too deeply while folding laundry, remembering her father's shop, now run by strangers. But they always came back to the table. 2 cups, 1 pot, and hands that found each other again and again, as if to say, "I'm here, still, always." One night, as the rain tapped softly on the roof and steam curled up from the teacups like dreams being born, May asked, "Do you ever miss the palace?" The applause? Li Shen looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and brushed a tea leaf from her collarbone. "Only when you're not talking." And just like that, she laughed. That laugh, his favorite poem of all. They never called it forever, but somehow, forever found them. Years passed like gentle streams, quiet, steady, never needing to rush. The world changed around them, but their days stayed painted in the same soft hues. Green tea steam in the morning, ink stains on fingers, the rustle of dried herbs, and laughter shared over cracked porcelain cups. The poet and the tea merchant's daughter became something of a legend in the nearby towns. People whispered about the man who once recited verses in grand halls, now living among the plum trees, and the woman with the jasmine sweet voice who could brew a tea that made memories rise like mist. Sometimes strangers would come knocking, young scholars, curious poets, wandering tea lovers, hoping to glimpse the magic. They never stayed long. May would offer a warm cup and a kind smile. Li Shen would nod and go back to his verses. There was nothing showy about their love, but in its quietude, it humbled those who watched it bloom. May's father eventually came to visit. It was years later, and his beard had gone white, but his eyes still held the weight of tea leaves and rain-soaked ledgers. He stood at the gate, awkwardly. "I heard you built a life here," he said, glancing at the small garden filled with sweet osmanthus and half-read scrolls. I wanted to see if it was true. May welcomed him inside without a word. They brewed tea, no grand talk, just jasmine in porcelain and the warmth of hands that had worked too long. And when he finally left, he pressed a paper-wrapped package into her palm. "These leaves come from your mother's garden," he said softly. "She would have wanted you to have them." It wasn't an apology, it was something gentler. Perhaps forgiveness, perhaps understanding. That night, they brewed the tea together. May and Li Shen drank it slowly, sitting side by side under the stars, the scent delicate, like memory distilled into steam. Li Shen kept writing until his hands grew slower. May kept blending teas until the herbs began to whisper back with familiarity. They grew older, but not dimmer. One spring morning, a breeze slipped through the open window, stirring a scroll on Li Shen's desk. On it, a final verse, unfinished. May picked up the brush and without hesitation added her own line, not a correction, a continuation. Their story, like the best teas, didn't need an ending, only an aftertaste, lingering, fragrant, real. And now, as you lie beneath your covers, eyes just beginning to flutter closed, think of the poet's hands resting over warm tea, the soft sigh of plum blossoms brushing against a bamboo wall, and the slow hush of lives lived gently. Love doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it's a quiet cup placed beside you every morning, a verse written into your silence. Let the echoes of their laughter drift into your dreams. Let the scent of jasmine and old paper wrap around your thoughts like a blanket. You're safe here, in stories, in stillness, in the space where words turn into sleep. Good night, dear listener. Dream softly, dream sweetly.